welcome to the final video of the post-apocalyptic kit bash build of the 1966 Pontiac GTO, where I go from this pile of parts to this sexy beast. I won't be going over the complete build. This will be more of a focus on the painting, weathering, and detailing of the model. I was trying a different format for this video set to see how it would do. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the journey. So let's get started. So the biggest issue I encountered when painting the model this time is I was using very cheap acrylic paints and thinning them down, and I hadn't got the ratios right. So as you can see, when I start off, there's a bunch of speckling and it's really wet. So I ended up having to adjust the pressure and go back and add more paint and basically mess with it until I got the paint mixture right, at least right enough to be able to spray and spray somewhat decent. So lesson learned, make sure you always do a test before you start spray painting your model. You want to sit there and try and make sure that you've got your ratio set before you start painting. It'll save you a lot of time and headaches. So once I got the main rust coat down, I used a hairdryer to go ahead and dry the acrylic as fast as I could, and I put it in a dehydrator for about 30 minutes just to try to help it too. So this coating is going to be the lighter coat. It's kind of a more orangish color, and I used an airbrush texture template in order to get that mottled effect. So highly recommend it. It does really well. The thing I learned from this is I need to do a lot more of this mottled coating. On that second layer, I need a lot more. So that's what this is mainly about in this section here. that the base rust coat layers were down, after that I went ahead and used hairspray and sprayed on 2 light mist coats to protect the rust layer. That was done before I'm doing the blue painting. You want to do it about arm's length away, and again it's 2 light coats, and then you want to use a hair dryer, dry each coat between, and then once that's all nice and set, then you can go ahead and start spraying your main body color. In this case I went with kind of a off marina blue, which was offered in 1966, and I got the mixture a lot better this time. It wasn't perfect, but it ended up spraying a lot better. And as you can see, I'm not too worried about getting it perfect because it's going to be a post-apocalyptic car, which is supposed to have a worn finish, but I didn't want to go with a rust bucket, so I wanted to get a good coating on it, so I wasn't worried if it was a little mottled or a little cloud pattern or whatever. Biggest thing was just getting good coverage on it to where when I got to the chipping, actually doing the chipping and everything, I wouldn't just like burn through in 2 seconds. So went on a little bit thicker than I really wanted, but it still ended up working out really well. So again, this is going over 2 light mist coats of hairspray. It's number 3 hold. I believe it's Tresemme, because it doesn't have all the alcohol and perfumes and all that kind of stuff in it. And the main focus was going to be on the body part. I wasn't worried about the engine bay because the hood is going to be closed. So I'm not worried about all the details, but just in case you could see down into the hood, I wanted to have at least some rust color in there. So this is the main focus, and enjoy the painting. So for the interior, I decided to use Tamiya black. I think I used Tamiya black, but no, I'm sorry. This is actually the acrylic black, the cheap acrylic black. As you can see, it's spraying just like the first coating was. I forgot to put primer on this coat, and it didn't do very well. It stuck and did everything, but it would have been so much easier to paint with primer on it. So the biggest thing with these cheap acrylics especially is always make sure you're using a good primer. The primer is not really about hiding surface imperfections, it's more about giving it something to really good stick to. As you can see, it's going on super wet, and I ended up having to do 2 or 3 light layers to get it really dialed in. And again, I still didn't have this cheap acrylic paint really dialed in on the water to paint to airbrush medium to flow improver. There was a lot. So I went back and forth, but it did the job, and it stays on really well, and it did really well. So it ends up being a really flat black, but it worked out well. After I got the main body color done and everything, that's when I wanted to start trying to prep the paint for doing all the chipping and weathering. So I used 10,000 grit sandpaper because the acrylic dries to a matte finish, and I wanted the finish to be more of a satin. I didn't want it to be gloss because it's an older paint job in the post-apocalyptic type thing. It's not like it's out in the middle of nowhere in a desert and everything's been bleached off, and it's several years. The goal is maybe about a year into the collapse to where the paint is not exactly doing very well. He hasn't, obviously been able to do a lot of maintenance on it. You're not going to waste water on cleaning your car in this type of a situation. But the nice thing was that it put a nice kind of satin sheen to it and leveled it out a little bit. And it also brought up a little bit of graininess to it, which was really good. So I sped up the footage here because just wanted to get through it a little bit faster. But this main focus is on buffing the body out. As you can see, I actually switched over to an eraser because it doesn't burn through the paint. I'm not using any liquid. It's literally rubbing the paint surface, and you can almost see what it's doing to the paint. Some of it smooths and it creates a little bit of streakiness to it. Highly recommend, if you're wanting to do something different with your paint jobs, use a rubber eraser. And I'm using light to medium pressure. I'm not doing a lot of pressure because I don't want to burn through any of the raised points or anything. It's about just doing a different way to burnish the paint. So it gives it a little bit different effect from using like sandpaper. So different technique for you. And this is actually to burnish down the paint job, which is to make sure it really gets a satin finish to it. This is a blender from an art store that you use for blending pencils, colored pencils. And it works really well. As you can see it brings up the sheen, and it brings up almost a kind of a metallic sheen to it. So it's kind of a nice mixture. So I've used sandpaper, rubber eraser, and now the burnisher. And as you can see, it creates different looks to the paint to give it different effects. So it's not just one solid kind of surface. I really like the way it looked and came out. Welcome to the heart of the video, which is hairspray chipping. So this is one way to do it. So there are a few different ways to do hairspray chipping when you actually think about it. So the main part, though, is you have the layer beneath that you want to reveal. Then you're going to have two light mist coats of hairspray, preferably number 3 hold, something along like Tresemme. Make sure they're dry between each one, and then put on your top coat, however thick or thin that you want to do it. Just remember, you're going to want to test and kind of work with the paint until you get it figured out. Different paints do react differently to the way the water goes through the paint to get to the hairspray layer. Okay, you're not removing paint technically. The water's going through the paint, and it's activating the hairspray, which is dissolving it. And then that's what's left is the underneath layer shows through. So the finite chipping that I'm demonstrating a lot here is using paint brushes, like pushing brushes. As you can see, it gets really nice flaky chips. And this the problem with this acrylic paint is that it's not high density, so you have to be careful about how much water you use, which is ultimately what this is all about. Generally, you want to go really, really light. You always want to go dry to damp when you're working with hairspray chipping, okay? And there are several different ways to do it. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but this is the way I like to do it, with doing the little bits and pieces so you can get really fine chipping effects. So this was a technique developed by a guy, or introduced by a guy back like 10 to 14 years ago. I don't know his name, but Michael Rinaldi of Rinaldi Studios loves using it, and I watched a whole bunch of his videos here on YouTube about how to do it, and I love the effect. It takes just a mild learning curve to get used to, but it's really easy. The biggest thing is starting out damp, or actually almost no water, and then working your way up. As you can see here, using this Q-tip, you can see that I've got it pretty wet, but what I discovered is that some parts of this paint were pretty thick, and I had to really work some water in there. But as you can see, it dries out, just like what you saw. And the key is, once you start seeing the chips form like that, it's like, once you have what you look, move on. Don't keep messing with it, okay? Because it's really easy to mess up your chip when you're not paying attention. And the goal here was a bunch of smaller chips. I don't want this to be I didn't want a rust bucket. I wanted a dirty, kind of worn, with some mild rusting areas. And I'm basically working my way around the entire model to hit the areas that I think would be, chipping first, or would be taking damage first. So for the rest of this section, it's pretty much just watching how I do the different, using different tools and water, and watching the chips come out. And I think this is a that both these brushes are a number 2 Taklon. And as you can see, this one's a shorter bristle, and as you kind of push and kind of glide over the surface, and even there you can see how it moves some of the paint particles around, the paint pigment, which creates different wash tones to the paint job as well. So not only do you get chipping, but you can also kind of shuffle the paint particles around, the pigment around, to create different sheens and different effects on the paint job itself. And normally behind a lot of these areas, the lower parts of the panels, when you're going to start seeing a lot of that rust in these areas where water would catch and then kind of work its way through the paint, or it gets a scratch and then the water gets in there and then the rust starts. And again, I'm just working slowly around the section. This is where the bumper is going to be connecting to the car. So, water, stuff like that would generally get stuck down inside those areas. So that's what I'm kind of looking at. I'm just gently working the surface, seeing my chipping start, and then just manipulating it the way I want it to go. Okay, this is an older brush that I had. And I cut the bristles even shorter to make it more like a stiff brush, and then I used scissors to kind of make the point go to a conical type of point, but it still has a flat tip to it. This one is more of a pushing tool. You're kind of trying to push the paint away and reveal the chips beneath it. And again, just gently working the surface to get the look that I'm looking for. And you can see the brush is a little damp. And then you can see that I could feel also when the paint was about to give. As I started working with it, I could start to anticipate when it was going to break through. And you also find that doing this it's very relaxing, and actually it's kind of fun to do to see the chips appear. And look how finite the edges are. You can really, really get these nice scratchy edges. There you can see the chips just starting to form. And usually around where the door opens and closes will get nicked and chipped. So that's kind of what I'm simulating here with that. And a trick you can do to really make it good for one side is put tape along the panel line there to where it will only hit the one side. So, and I should have done that with this, but I was able to control it pretty well. But next time, a lesson learned, I use tape later, is put tape around the lines for the areas so that you don't go over that line if you don't want to. And this rain gutter, I decided that the pointy Q-tip gets in there a little bit easier, and it rubs. And I love the way it rubbed off the paint and it left those chips. And always where that corner is, where the drip rail meets the quarter panel, there's always going to be a possibility of rust in that area. So this is where I'm simulating the roof rack. The homemade roof rack is going to go through the body. Since you can't see the interior, basically it would go. The posts are going to go all the way down to the frame. That's the best way to make sure that they're supported. They can support the weight, and you don't want to have a ton of weight actually on the roof, because then it's the only thing holding it up is the pillars and then part of the where the body panels connect to the frame. And I'm also going to put a simulated weld using Tamiya putty or two-part epoxy putty around these two. I would encourage you as you're doing chipping like this kind of hairspray chipping, use different tools to see what kind of effect they'll have. So I've got like the pointed Q-tip. I've got this really kind of short bristly brush. And then I have the regular blender brushes, which can work in. They each have a different effect and a different way that they interact with the paint. So I encourage you to play around with it and see which shows they do. Just remember, if you want really fine chips, go slow, take your time. You're using very light pressure to a medium pressure, but you can feel the surface and you can feel the paint as you start to work with it, and it tells you how much water and how much pressure you're going to need. Really pay attention and kind of feel as you go to make sure that you're getting the effect that you want. You'll discover in some areas you may need more water than others because you've maybe hit it a little bit with more paint, but you can also see how it's pushing the paint pigment around and creating a different kind of look to the paint, which I love the way it was doing it. But this section ended up taking a lot more water. I actually worked this close to 30 seconds with water before it started to chip out. This is near real time as far as the pace and everything that it's going. So, but I didn't include all of the footage of the chipping because that would have been well over 45 minutes to an hour just on chipping alone. But the biggest part is I wanted you guys to see how hairspray chipping can really, really take your model to the next level. And again, you can just start to see the little tiny chips forming. I mean, it's just so nice once you see them to start to come out. But as you notice, you can see how the pigment is moving around and how it has a different sheen to it, to the surrounding paint. And I love that. It gives a different worn effect to the paint. So not only do you get the chips, but you also get a different kind of look to your paint job, which I love. And to reiterate, I wanted to make sure that the chipping didn't go on both sides of the rear of the trunk here, because that's the part that's going to lift up, and that you usually find rust in those areas around the trunk lid. So that's why I put the tape down to protect that layer so I could push it and pull it and do whatever and just get that chipping along that line. And it looks really cool when you do it because it looks more accurate. So again, encourage you to play around with ideas, and you can protect areas with tape or masking or whatever, and then chip away around it. You'll also discover that on large flat surfaces, it's a little bit harder to get details because there's no texture. But when you have a matte paint and you burnish and do different things to it, you just gotta pay attention to the paint. And here I just added more water, circled it around, got it to go through the paint, and then just continued to chip. I just pushed in the directions, and here you can see by circling the brush, you get a different effect or different way the chips look. So again, experiment with the different ways that you work with the brush itself, and you may discover the chips form in slightly different ways, which is pretty cool. Now, what's funny is that I did this really nice job on the roof, by the end of it, and then I ended up hiding the whole roof with the homemade roof rack, which is kind of irritating, but it was good practice for me, and I really wanted to see what I could do with it. So, but I love the way these chips are coming out. You can just see these tiny little finite chips. It just looks awesome. Here you can see a good example of how the pigment's moving around by the brush, and how, as you can see, your brush picks up paint. Don't forget, every once in a while you got to wipe your brush off. Sorry, I started to drift off camera here. But you're going to need to also clean your brush off a lot, because you're going to be picking pigment up with the brush. So don't forget, otherwise what happens, you start just pushing it all around, and that's where you get this muddy look. So you push it around, and then you wipe off the brush, push it around, wipe off the brush, push it around. And you may discover you need a little bit more water at different times too. So, and I love the way that, see this, just these beautiful tiny little flakes pop out. Just love the way it popped out. I mean, there you can really see the water as it's working its way through the paint. And to see, the longer it sits, that means you got a lot more water on the surface. You really got to be careful, because it can all suddenly just break loose. So there we go. You can see the chip start. And I'm going really light at this point, because I know that I can see how much water's on the surface, but you can even see it drying as you go. And worst case, just stop what you're doing, use a hair dryer, dry it off, and then go again. But look at those little beautiful, just beautiful flicks there. Flakes and everything, and chips. Flicks, there we go, a flaky chip. Don't forget, when you're working with areas with raised detail, you got to be really gentle, because the paint's super thin on the top of those sections. So really, really light, go really light, and work your chips up. And sorry, I drifted off camera there a little bit. But really take your time when you want to get this really intricate, small chipping details. And of course, this is simulating, not simulating, it's doing the rust around the inside lips of the hood. And again, the intention was not to leave the hood up. So, but just in case, I changed my mind. I wanted to have the chipping and the paint in there. And again, remember, as you're working around edges, edges are super thin. There's a very thin layer of paint on top of those edges, so you got to be really gentle and take your time. When you think about it, raised areas are going to end up being chipped faster than the flat areas around it. So those are the areas that get caught more. More things rub on those. So, and also the front of the vehicle as it goes forward is going to receive more damage than the sides and the rear. So just think about, as you're working with your model, which direction it moves in, what it hits, what directions, it's going to come from. And you can also simulate scratches if you want to, using tools. I didn't worry about doing any scratches on this one because of the other details. I just wasn't worried about it. It's not like he's driving through forests and stuff like that. So anyway, again, watch your edges. Working on those lower parts of the quarter panels, because that's usually where the water is going to collect as it runs down off the vehicle. And there's also a sharp edge there, so it's going to rub more, and it'll have more chance of dust, rock, dirt, limbs, things like that getting kicked up by the tires and by the road doing that chipping. And there again, using the tape to protect the door, so I can get the chipping right next to the panel line there, right next to what is simulating the door opening. And don't forget that you can pre-apply water in one area and let it soak in, and then work another area. Then you can go back to it if you need to. So that sail panel up there, I just realized I needed to leave some water on it if I was going to work it some more. And you can see the water sitting and then working its way through the paint. And I'm pre-applying and then just gently working the edges and gently working it. I just love the way these chips were coming out. And you can even see there in the water how it's light blue. It's remember, don't forget to wipe your brush off and, re-wet it as you need. But remember, damp, go really, really light. Now this paint job needed a little bit, it was basically between right around the damp part. So again, practice with your paint. Different paints are going to chip differently. And how you spray your hairspray layer is going to be a huge factor in how those chips are going to come off. If you go super thick and wet with that hairspray, you may lose giant flakes coming off. So again, experiment. If you're not sure, spray on a test piece, get an old body, work with it that way. And you can do different effects. Now, the neat thing about hairspray chipping, you could do this, then you could spray this whole layer over with another hairspray layer and then put paint over top of this and then chip on top of this. And let's say you wanted to preserve this layer, then put a varnish over top of it, which is just a protective coating between the layers. So put a protective clear down, wait till it dries, and then you could throw on another layer of hairspray, then throw on another layer of paint, and then you would have a paint on top of paint effect. And you can do this as much as you want for whatever effect that you want. I just wanted to do the one set. In future builds, I'm going to do some more multi-chipping and multi-layering where you have layer upon layer upon layer. And in that lower corner there, I realized that I used too much water and it literally flaked off a big flake, which I was like, crap. So I was like, okay, I'm done with that section. And what you can always do is use the original body paint. And you can go back in and correct that if you want to. You could paint acrylic paint back into any of these chips and put color back in if you want. And also don't forget that this is the first layer of chipping. It's like I'm going to use oil paint rendering later with different rust colors to fill in these rust chips to make them look better. So if you end up with a big chip like that, don't worry about it. You can always repair it. You could actually respray it with paint. You could put paint on with a brush. You could, dot paint into it. You could kind of reverse chip it by painting if you wanted to. So there are ways to fix it even if you get a big spot like that. Or you can just decorate it out with more rust effects. Moving on to the hood, I started chipping the hood and then realized I wasn't recording, so I stopped and then turned the recording on. And again, I had to work the area a lot with water and to get it to start chipping. But once it gets chipping, remember, once you see the effect you want, stop. Don't mess with it anymore, okay? But here again, you can see how it's moving the pigment around and it's giving the texture, or it's giving the surface a different look and a different feel. And I love that because it adds so much depth and dimension to the model. And I apologize for the way my voice is sounding today. And it's a little froggy for some reason. I'm not sure why, but anyway. I just love the way these little chips were just popping out. I love this technique so much. And don't forget, you can do this with any layer beneath it. It doesn't have to be rust. It can end up being a paint over paint layer. You could have like, if you're doing a military model or something, you could have like the base paint. Say it was camouflage and woodland, and then they painted a bunch of desert over top of it, and then now the desert's wearing off, and it's showing the the NATO camo underneath of it, or the German camo, or whatever underneath. So don't forget, you can do different things with it. There's so much you can do when you use this type of technique. And again, there's many different ways to chip. You can use the salt method. You could use any kind of material that's going to be dissolved by water or something in between. I mean, you could even just apply this, and you could use sandpaper if you wanted to. You could wet sand the surface to get a burnished effect or to do it. So I'm going to be trying different techniques on different cars as I go, just to see how they do and to experiment with the different ways to get different looks. And since the original GTO would have the 389 in it with the dual carburetor or the triple carburetor setup, the 3 deuce, I was simulating that the driver, the owner, put a blower onto the motor, and of course you got to cut out the hood scoop, the original hood part, to make room for the blower hat to stick through and the carburetors to stick through. So obviously, if that area through there around that rough cut is going to end up getting chipped faster, and it's going to get rust faster than the rest of the parts of the areas. And again, working a flat surface area, I'm using different directions with the Q-tip to try to get the chips going in different ways so that they don't look uniform. Again, it's all about randomness or randomnality. Actually, I don't think that's a word, but more random. Now with the surface dry, I'm going to use an eraser to kind of blend the surface together, because you could kind of see swirl marks where I had moved the pigment around with the water. So some kind of tool like an eraser or something, or a burnisher or whatever, can help take those swirl marks and stuff out of the paint if you want. And that's what I was kind of doing. I'm kind of wanting to streak the surface a little bit more and kind of really add a different look to the surface. And it kind of blends the different parts together, but it's not like a cohesive blend, which is really nice. Again, experiment with different tools, guys. There's many different ways you can do this. You could use sandpaper, you can use a rubber eraser, you can use Q-tips, you could use dry brushes, wet brushes. Just remember, if you do wet, you're going to activate the hairspray. The surface is dry, so as long as I don't rub too hard, I'm not going to rub through the surface of the paint. And as you see, as I move it around catching the light, you can see the different sheen it gives to the surface of the paint, which I love. It just really makes the paint job look like it's fading and wearing out. So I realized that chip over there looked too uniform. To me, it was like, it looks like a rectangle. And I'm like, okay, so here I'm pushing with the blender brush to get the chips to form. And there you can see them just start, and see how the water gets absorbed into it's literally going through the paint. Remember, you want to know your paint, because this acrylic paint is not completely cured. So you can still work it through. And I ended up being actual to work with this paint probably about 3 to 4 days. So know your paint, do a lot of work with it. The key is, don't let the paint completely cure. If it cures, you're not going to get water through it, and it's not going to work. So you want to do hairspray chipping with the water method like as soon as you can after you've done your paint job. So literally, I sprayed all the paint and everything, and then I was working with it within a couple of hours. So, and acrylic dries really fast, but it doesn't cure completely for a few days. And it also, that depends on the type of paint that you're using. So know your paint, guys. Work with your paint. I just really love how these chips pop out. I mean, just such small little intricate shaped chips. They're just beautiful the way they come out. You can try to do this with a brush, but you're going to be doing a lot of work. And again, there's different ways to chip. You can paint chip as well. But I love this technique. To me, it's the most realistic look that you can get. But neither right or wrong, guys. This is not about right or wrong. This is about just different ways to do things. Light pressure, because I could tell the paint was ready to go through. Yep, there it is. Look at those chips. Just beautiful. And that's it for the hairspray chipping method on this one, guys. So next is going to be oil paint rendering. Here's the thing with the oil paint rendering. I really screwed this up on the first go around. So there's the little cardboard palette, which Michael Rinaldi had a great idea with that, is you could use a piece of sticky tape, two-sided sticky tape with cardboard. The reason you want to put oil paint on the cardboard is so that it absorbs all the extra linseed oil. And I'll be honest, I was using really cheap, crappy acrylic paint, and the pigments in the paint there's not a lot of pigment in there overall when you really look at versus artist grade. And I had a lot of problems because you've got to go to do oil paint rendering right, which is a form of weathering. You've really got to go light, and you've got to go like very, very minimal. And it's about the amount of thinner that you put on the brush and then to paint. That's 100% paint. And then I'm just barely using thinner. And the problem was the paint wasn't responding like the way I saw others doing it. And it was bugging me. And I kept trying different things with it. And it just didn't look the way I wanted it to. That just looks like paint. Now that is semi-okay right there. But I ended up wiping a lot of it off. And here's the beauty of oil paint, is it takes a long time to cure. And you can work with it. See how you got the streaks, or there's streaks in it, but they don't look good. Again, you really got to go small amounts, work it up, really build your opacity through time with oil paint rendering. You really got to take your time. But when you do, the effects are so incredible. Sorry about that. So I'll be honest, this is an example more of how not to do oil paint rendering, because the paint just sucks so badly. And I ended up buying a lot of Eptilone 502 oil paints to do touch-ups and to do work after this, I got really frustrated with this paint. It was just, it's the cheap stuff from Hobby Lobby, and it was just it's not garbage, but just it wasn't doing the job. And part of it was my fault. I mean, I didn't use the paint correctly. But the better the quality of the paint that you use, the more pigment there is, the easier it will be to do oil paint rendering. And I highly encourage you to watch a lot of different videos on how people do it. There's several different ways to do oil paint rendering, which is for weathering and detailing out your vehicles, or your Gundams, or your mechs, or your boats, or whatever you want to do. And again, there's several different techniques. And you'll see in the final pictures that the car doesn't look like this, the way this paint is. I rubbed most of it off and then redid it again. So again, I'm just showing you, these are the basic techniques, which is get some paint on your brush, and then put it on. And here what I was trying to do is I was using the original body color that I used to create streaks by doing reverse streaking. In essence, I put body paint back into the color. And I found I pretty much had the same color in oil that I had in acrylic. Now remember, you can do oils over acrylics, but you can't do acrylics over oils. It'll end up being a really bad paint mess if you try to do that. If you do, you're going to need to put a clear coat in between the two layers if you're going to try to do acrylics back over top of oils, but good luck, it's going to be a mess. And remember, the key with this is that once you're done with this type of work, do not put a top coat on it. Do not put a top coat. If you do, you're going to flatten the whole surface, and it's going to look uniform and junky. It'll look like a muddy mess. You want to, because when you get done with this, you can use powdered pigments, you can use pigments, you can use dust, dirt, debris, whatever you want to on top of it. So the key here is to not do a final top coat, okay? If you're going to be handling the model like for wargaming or something like that, you're going to have to put some kind of coating unless you've got really hardy paint. So just something to think about. But this is a model that's going to go on a shelf and not be touched again, or rarely ever touched. But as you can see here, to me, this just looked like somebody put paint on the side of a vehicle, like they tried to repaint it and it was a bad paint job. Now, if that's what you're going for, then there you go. This would be a way to do it. But it really was just not looking the way I wanted. I really had to slow down. And it's all about small amounts of paint going on, and you're building up the layers and you're building up the look that you want, and just work the section that you want. And then when you work that section, it's going to tell you what the rest of the car is going to look like, or the rest of the object is going to look like, and then you'll know what your pathway is. So the nice thing about this is that you can come back to the paint job and know what you did and know how you got there, and that's the key. So I'm just going to let it play for a bit. So these are very similar techniques in using the brushes. I like to use spotters to do streaking and liners to do streaking. You can use whatever brush you want. You can use number 2 filbert brushes or things like that. But yeah, I just, and you can fix a paint job like this using thinners and paints and stuff. You're gonna have to do a ton of work with it. And I was just not happy with the way it looked. It was not doing it. And I'll be honest, when I ended up using the makeup sponge to wipe out a lot of this, it actually worked out pretty neat after that. So that is it for the oil paint rendering that I did that I basically showed. So at this point, I'm doing more. Well, actually, this is still oil paint rendering. Now I'm using the rust to really detail out the rust. And here you can see when I had better paint, this is a couple of days later. Actually, it's close to a week because I had to wait for the paint to get here. But this is using a really pointer brush or a spotter brush to fill in to add detail to the rust chips that were created by the base chipping layer. But you can see that light blue spot right there, which I did that with paint. I did lighter blue. I took the main body color and I added a little bit of white to it. And actually it's more like an off-white. And just lightened the shades up and then dabbed it on and then really worked with it to create like a different fade spot. And you can see down in that lower right corner by the hole there, I really was getting the oil paint rendering dialed in at this point, especially with the better paints. And you can do it with cheaper paints. You just have to it's a lot harder to work with, and you have a lot less pigment to work with. But a lot better example. Now, this is a lot better example of oil paint rendering, is what you see on the fenders now. Yeah, look at that roof. That's what you can achieve with oil paint rendering and weathering. You can do it. I really love the way this paint job, and I love that roof, and then I completely covered it up. And I'm just, it's like, wow. But at least I have it recorded for posterity so you can see what the roof looked like. See, that looks so much better on the side. I got and you can see I finished doing a lot of the putting the body together, put the engine into it. You know, this was more of towards the final stages of I'm getting ready to be done with the assembling the final armor pieces and all that. So I'm doing a lot of that final oil paint rendering and weathering. And then of course, as I add the other materials like the armored plating around the windows and stuff, and the roof rack and everything, I add the details as I go. So I kind of built, assembled, painted, assembled, painted, assembled, painted, and went on there. So. Again, I just love the way that roof came out. And I'm glad I have it here because you can't see it in the final model, but there it is. And ultimately, the paint job came out so well. That's why I didn't I was going to originally put like a applique steel armor on the sides, the quarter panels and the doors of the car. But I love the paint job so much. I'm like, nah. So what I'm simulating is that he put the armored plating on the inside of the panels. So that way it wasn't so obvious. So I didn't want somebody like, wanting to try to take the panels off the car, but just taking the whole panel off. Yeah, the paint job just turned out so well at this point that I'm like, I don't want to cover it up. So originally I was going to put, again, armored plating on all the quarter panels and the doors. And the paint ended up going on a lot brighter than it did. Now this section here is I was using the Gallery metallic markers that they just came out with. So you can see I have a lot more assembled on the car. And I did simulated ugly welds, really ugly welds using Tamiya putty. And using like putting actually, I'm sorry, this was the 2-part epoxy putty. The Milliput, and then it hardens up within about an hour or two. So I needed to make it look like welds, like really bad welds. And this dark steel ended up looking like just beautiful melted metal. I really wanted to simulate, this stuff just doesn't magically appear on there. It had to be welded together. It had to be put on there somehow. You could simulate it by putting bolts or whatever. And I'll be honest, these welds are too big. But I'm simulating that the person really didn't know how to weld, but they could get it on the car. And I wanted to add it to that really grungy look. So this is just about using the metallic markers, which I love these metallic markers. They're beautiful paint markers. Got into the cracks and crevices. It flows really well. Highly recommend them, guys. The Galeri metallic marker set is really, really nice. I haven't used any other ones yet, but I've used this set, and I highly endorse them. They're really nice. And no, I'm not sponsored by them or anything. I just really like them. So I wanted to show you some of the work with them. And again, I'm simulating really horrible welds. But it worked in the end. Next one, the welds will be better and different. I figured out a better way after this. By the way, what I simulated is that he used these bumper brackets, welded those onto the back bumper, and go through the frame to the frame, and then used 3 square steel rods or iron rods that would be welded to those pieces to form like a back crash bumper. So I wanted a rear crash bumper, to protect the rear of the vehicle. The trunk still operates, so I had to displace the holders for those rear bars to where you could still get your hand in and be able to unlock the trunk, because I wanted a lockable trunk still, because this is kind of the apocalypse or the post-collapse. And I mildly weathered the bottom of the vehicle. You're not going to see it. It's going to be displayed regular, standing up, but I just did some of it just for the heck of it. So those lights on the top are from a semi-tractor trailer model kit. And I think it's the California Hauler by AMT, if I remember right. And I wanted the spotlights on the top because all these modern LED lights, haven't come out until like the late 2000s. This is simulating. This is close to the collapse started in the early 80s or mid 80s. And a lot of these, like the parts on the rear, are actual metal grating, or I'm sorry, metal mesh that I bought off of Amazon. And off of Amazon. And I got the different sizing so that I could have different looks for the different metal. So that's real metal mesh. And then that front armored piece is actually a piece of polystyrene that it's like, I think 0.030 millimeters thick. And I just used my metal paints and techniques, and I weathered it up to make it look like worn metal. And I think it worked out really well. It's to simulate about 1/4 inch plate steel that's been cut and then welded over the windshield to protect the occupants, of course. And then the side windows and then the rear, of course, are protected as well. And I ended up putting a lot more weld material around this because I realized it'd need to be more solid weld. And you can see I even put some of the mesh on the front of the blower hat there, the air intake, so that large debris and objects couldn't be pushed in there to clog up the carburetors. And you can kind of see a little bit of the front crash bumper, which I actually are out of my parts kit. I found 2 older style bumpers that just look so cool, and then I flipped them, made them opposite, and then glued them together, and then simulate that they got welded together, and then attached to the front bumper to be the crash bumper. And you'll see more details here in a bit. That rear rack is there, and that's actually like a grill type steel grill from another kit, is another place to be able to attach bags or netting or rope or whatever you want to that you'd carry back there in the apocalypse or whatever. So it's just another way to carry more. And then there's going to be a custom roof rack that I completely designed and made out of polystyrene tubing, like evergreen tubes, tube and rod and mesh to make a roof rack. And I wanted it to go around the lights too. And here's just showing some detailing of the rear bumper. Again, oil paint rendering on the bumper. But it looked too muddy, so I ended up wiping a lot of it down and just trying to neutralize it, and then just flecking and doing little bits of rust and stuff on the back. It just ended up being too muddy, so I did a little bit of paint work after this, after I got done filming all this and fixed it, so you can see it in the final build. Okay, I did a bunch of other assembly and things off of the camera. I'm just showing the weathered wheels. After that, you're going to see the final finished build, guys. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.
Driving down this broken road, night is endless, haunted by the shadows, ghosts of regret. Desert winds, they whisper, lost and faded. No direction, no hope, nowhere to go. Abandoned cities, crumbling memories tainted. Fuel running low, life running thin. Mirrors show nothing but a trail of sorrow. Past is chasing mile after mile, running from the nightmares, dark and grim. Empty highway stretching, souls gone dim. Disperse the fuel, silence loud as thunder. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Desolation fills the air, ruins all around. Wasteland stretching, echoes of the dam. Hopes are buried under ash and dust. Futures fading as we rust.